love that we are going through the book of Nehemiah, and as we go through it, we get to look at all of these challenges and all the opposition that came against Nehemiah as he is doing this work that God called him for, and it allows us to have the opportunity to say, hey, is it worth all of that? Is it worth all of the risk and all of the challenge and all the sometimes just flat hard work to see the things through that God has promised in our lives? And the world would tell you no and say, hey, just go do yourself, make yourself happy, it's not worth it. And often we know that just ends up not working out. And so we get to this place where we say, okay, so if following Jesus is worth the risk, how do we do it? How do we have the courage to walk it out? How do we have the courage to follow him when the rest of the world says, I don't get it? When the rest of the world is opposition against us? When it seems like as we walk through life, there are more and more obstacles in front of us. One of the things I don't know if you've realized, I don't know if you've noticed, but when you start walking with God, challenges don't decrease, they start to increase. And part of the reasons that they increase is because when you start walking with God, he says, awesome, let's change some things. Let's work through some things. God doesn't say, go fix yourself and then come to me. He says, come to me broken, but then we're going to change some stuff. And change is hard. It's a challenge. It feels vulnerable. And that's what we're looking at as we go through the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, as he leads these people, he is in the great unknown for his life. He had never been a wall builder before. He had never led a city of people. He was a king's cupbearer in a country that wasn't even his own. But when we walk in faith, God calls us into places that are uncomfortable, and he grows us there. Life is full of opposition and obstacles. How do we deal with it? We're going to look at Nehemiah chapter 4 here in just a minute, and we'll look at what does that chapter teach us about that. When I first graduated college, I got a commission in the Air Force, and the first thing I did is I went off to flight school. Now, I knew I was going to flight school for a few months, so I tried to get as prepared as possible, and to get prepared, I just watched Top Gun a lot, right? Because I figured that would teach me all that I needed to know. And so I knew how to look the part of flight school, and I got to be honest, I practiced really hard at that, and so I looked pretty cool, and I knew it. And so I went with this huge head off to Pensacola, Florida, and going to flight school, and we start flight school, and it's going okay, and I'm going through the classes, and you do all this ground school classes, and they teach you everything that they want you to know about how an airplane engine works in 1 week. And on that Friday, you take the test, and if you pass the test, you live to see the next week. And so every week, it's full of pressure, and you've got this test that's going to determine whether you live another week in flight school. And so you go through, and at the same time, they're walking you through these physical requirements, and I went to a flight school on a Navy base, so I had to do all these swimming requirements as well, because they're always afraid that their sailors are going to fall off boats or something, I don't know. And so you got to know how to swim, even though I'm in the Air Force and I'm never going to be on a boat. I had to do all that. And so we go through all these things, and then it's time for me to get close to start flying, and it is September 1st, and the Navy comes and says, we're out of money. We have no money to fly until the new fiscal year. Now, what organization plans a flight school but only plans their money to be 11 months worth of flight school? The U.S. Navy. That's what organization does that. And so they're out of money, and so we have days that we have to fill. So they start saying, hey, well, we're going to do some extra physical stuff, and so you can become a rescue swimmer. And so I got to learn how to be a rescue swimmer and all these different things. And we'd go do workouts and stuff like that. And one of the obstacles that I had in front of me was literally an obstacle course. And we would go out and we'd do this obstacle course every so often. And I had done okay on it early, but I had a bad shoulder. And I was only in flight school by the good graces of this waiver that an Air Force doctor had given me, but if I ever had problems with my shoulder, I would be disqualified. So when I started having problems with my shoulder, I, of course, lied about it. And I said everything's fine. And so I just kept going through, and I was trying to figure out how you do this obstacle course with one good arm and one bad. And so I'd try to do it left-handed. And there was this one wall, 15 foot high, with a rope down it. You had to climb over and go over the top. And it's not too bad with two arms, but with one it was a challenge. And so I'd pull myself up with the left arm, and I'd hold myself there with the right, and I'd reach up and I'd pull again, and that's how I had to do it to get over. Well, one day, my foot slipped off the wall, and I caught myself with my right arm, and in that moment, flight school ended. Within the hour, I had a form that had disqualified stamped on it. That is one of those life-altering moments where you say, now what? And I had one of those moments. And over the next month or so, as I was waiting to say, okay, what's next? I don't know what's next. One of the things that I started to realize was that the obstacle of that wall wasn't really the challenge in front of me. In that month, I learned that the obstacle that I really was facing and needing to deal with was the fact that God was trying to get a hold of my life, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it. Because I wanted to be, cool guy from Top Gun. And I didn't want to be anything that God was calling me to. And all of a sudden I had this time, and I had this vulnerability and humility, right? When disqualified is stamped across the form, that creates a little humility. And I start saying, God, I had this plan. Now what? And the obstacle really became about my unwillingness and my fear over listening to what God was trying to tell me about my life. Before we knew it, we were whisked off to West Texas, where I went to intelligence officer school. And while I was there, it wasn't at all about what God was allowing me to do in the Air Force. It was all about what he wanted to do in my heart. And it was terrifying, because I could see God exposing things in me and calling me to steps of faith that I had never dreamed of. But the day that I slipped off of that wall was the day that God used to alter the course of my life, and it's the reason that I do what I do today. It started that weekend. And God uses great challenges, God uses enormous obstacles to grow us and to show us what he wants out of our life. Every New Testament book talks about persecution, trials, and perseverance. Every one of them. So if ever you're like, I want to read a happy book of the New Testament that's going to tell me that when I start following Jesus, everything's going to be daisies and sunflowers and just easy life. It doesn't exist. Because life's a challenge. Anybody here not know that? If so, I want to hang out with you for a while, because that sounds awesome. Life's a challenge. It's hard. But you know what? God says, through challenge, that's where I meet you and grow you. Listen to some of these verses that I pulled out of the New Testament. In James chapter 1, James is writing to this church that is literally moving and fleeing for their life. People are trying to kill them. And here's what he says to them. He starts off by saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." How many of you, last time that you had a huge challenge in your life, was like, raising the roof? This is awesome right here. Man, I'm so excited for this opportunity. No, not usually. And I don't think that they were jumping up and down and raising the roof. But what he's trying to get us to understand is that when there's when there's challenges, it's an opportunity for us to grow. It's an opportunity for us to be pushed out of our comfort zone, and outside of our comfort zone is where we are stretched. And we realize new things about us, and we learn new things about God. And that's where he wants to get us to. In Romans 5, it says, "We can rejoice, too, when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead us to disappointment. For we know how dearly God loves us because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with his love. When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. I love that it says, for we know that these problems, they develop endurance in us. Sometimes in life, our walk with Jesus is just about pressing on. Sometimes there's not big highlights. Sometimes there's not big victories. There's days where we say, God, because you gave me breath today, I'm getting up with you. I'm going to press on with you. And that's okay. God says in those moments when you are relying on me, when you are enduring through the challenges that God's given you in life, that life is throwing at you, I grow you there. I build your character. I help you find resolve to be able to be the people that God created us to be. The book of Nehemiah is a story of Nehemiah and God's people being faced with great obstacles and incredible opposition. If you were here last week, Gabe came up and he talked about the walls. Go ahead, go to the next slide for me, please. The walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed, and there are all these big gaps in it, and people are coming and they're raiding the city. And as they're coming and raiding the city, the people of Jerusalem, they start to just give up hope. And then Nehemiah gets to come and lead the people to restore the city of Jerusalem. Now, I want to remind you of what Gabe told us part of the city was like. The walls were 2 miles long, or 2 miles in circumference. And in that time, they were 20 feet high, and in some parts, 21 feet wide. That part just overwhelms me. 21 feet wide, that is super thick and big, and is going to take a ton of work to build that. And they start to gather, and they start to work together, and they start to build this up. And the task in front of them is overwhelming. Before they can do some of the things, they got to just clear everything out. They got to clean up before you can start rebuilding. You ever notice that? Sometimes in life, you got to clean some stuff up before you can really rebuild on it. A lot of times in my life, God says, hey, let's remove some stuff before we start to add to. And they've got to do that. They've got to clean out some broken spots in the walls, and then they start rebuilding. And in the midst of overcoming those obstacles to rebuilding, they start experiencing great opposition. Let's read chapter 4 and let's look at what that looks like, and let's look at what God says about it. What does Nehemiah do, and what can we learn as a church about that? Verse 1, it says, Sanballat was very angry when he learned that they were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officer, what does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, that stone wall would collapse even if a fox walked along the top of it. People love to mock what God's doing in your life. People love it. A lot of times the opposition comes because they look and they say, look at you trying to make your life different. When you accept Christ and you start living a new way, people want to come alongside. And somebody told me this week, I have people that come to me and they say, hey, we'll be here when you fall back. The world's waiting for it. And one of the reasons that the world's waiting for it is because we are a culture that love to say, man, if that person is kind of moving beyond us, I hope they fall back to us because that makes me feel better about me. We have this world that is self-centered and wants to see people stumble just so it validates their own struggles. And so we face opposition where people say, you're never going to make it. You're never going to make it. You can't overcome this. That obstacle in front of you, it's impossible. We face opposition. Opposition's going to come. How do we deal with it? Verse 4, Nehemiah says this. He says, then I prayed, hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. That is not the most compassionate prayer in the Bible. I just want you to know that. But here's what I love about it. One, when opposition comes, Nehemiah prays. So often, what do we want to do? We want to fight back. Oh, you want a piece of this? I will give you a piece of this. You're gonna come against us, I will come against you. Nehemiah doesn't rant to the people, he rants to God. And here's one of the things that I think is really cool, and you see it if you read through the Psalms. God is big enough to handle your rants. You don't need to go fight somebody else. You can just go and talk to God and say, God, I am so angry. And Nehemiah is angry because they're mocking God, and he says, I'm so mad that they're doing that. So, God, do something about it. Don't blot out their sins. That'd be great. Well, God's going to do what God's going to do. He's probably not going to be swayed by Nehemiah's plea here. But Nehemiah prays, and then instead of engaging the people, he says, you know what, God, I'm going to engage you. Here's my heart. I don't need to be caught up in arguments with Tobiah. I just need to vent with you, and then we need to move forward. Pray a lot. Let God handle the results. Verse 6, it says, at last the wall was completed to half of its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, Ammonites, and whoever those guys were, Ashdodites, heard that the work was going on ahead and that the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. They all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. So he already prayed once, and he wasn't like, hey, that's good, I don't need to do that anymore, I've already prayed. No, he continues to pray. And then, not only does he pray, he presses on. There are times that I pray and say, God, fix this. And you know what God says? No. No. He says, I want you to walk through this. I'll be with you. There are times where God says no because he wants me to persevere with him. He wants me to press on with him. He wants me to endure. Because faith is so often lived out when we say, God, man, I don't know how to do this. So I need you to be here to do it with me. So the people, they pray, but then they press on. They continue. They protect themselves. They're ready for what may come against them. Verse 10, it says, then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired, and there is so much rubble to be removed. We will never be able to build the wall by ourselves. Don't become your own opposition. I think so often we are our own worst enemies. We allow Satan to get in our brain and tell us that we cannot. Don't be your own greatest opposition. When I struggle the most in life, it's because self-doubt gets me. You tell me I can't, I stand strong with God. But sometimes my own head says, I can't. And that's when I need to be able to say, and I'm right, I can't. But God can. And he's with me. Don't become the own opposition to what God's doing in your life. Verse 11 says, meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they know what's happening, we will swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and they will attack us. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas, and I stationed the people to stand guard by families, armed with swords, spears, and bows. One of the things that I love about how they rebuilt the wall is that, A, they work together. Chapter 3, it's everybody doing their part. It's all hands on deck. everybody says, I've got a piece in this. And then, as opposition comes, they not only keep doing the work, but half of them say, you know what, I will peel off, and my job will be to have that other guy's back. To me, this is one of the best pieces of scripture about what the church needs to look like. Man, when you're being attacked, I've got your back. When you think you can't go on, I'm with you. When the opposition is chirping in your ear saying, you're going to fall soon, I'm going to remind you of the truth that God has already done great work in you, and I'm going to hold on to you. The church is about standing together and having each other's back. If God's with us, then what can stand against? And if God's with us, let's stand together with a God who's with us. Confidently. Verse 14 says, Then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people, and I said to them, Don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord, who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your home. We need to encourage each other with the truth of God. Remember the Lord, who is great and glorious. He is worth standing with. We stand together. Not because we have some great strength in ourselves, but because we know the God who is for us. Goes on and it says, when our enemies heard that we knew their plans and that God had frustrated them, we returned to our work on the wall. But from then on, only half of my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah, who were building the wall. The laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load, and the other hand holding a weapon. All the builders had a sword belted to their side. The trumpeters stayed with me to sound the alarm. Then I explained to the nobles and officials and all the people, the work is very spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. When you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it is when it sounds. Then God will fight for us. I love that last line. God's the one that's going to fight for us. God cares more about us than we could ever even know how to care for each other. But we're in it together. And I love that idea of the trumpet sounding and there's a rallying cry. And there are moments in life where we need to hear a rallying cry. And we need to come and be united around this opportunity to stand in the face of great opposition. And we surround each other and we walk out life together. It goes on and it finishes up and it says, we worked early and late, from sunrise to sunset, and half the men were always on guard. I also told everyone living outside the walls to stay in Jerusalem. That way they and their servants could help with the guard duty at night and working during the day. During this time, none of us, not I, nor my relatives, nor my servants, nor the guards who were with me, ever took off our clothes. We carried our weapons with us at all times, even when we went for water. There's just this continual preparedness. If God's for us, then who could stand against? I love that passage in Romans 8 because it reminds us that there is no challenge, there is no opposition, there is no obstacle that God isn't bigger than. So often we look at it and we say, however are we going to be able to do this? However are we going to be able to survive this? And the answer is, we won't on our own. But we aren't supposed to stand alone. We're supposed to stand and remember that God is with us. And God is for us. And He made us part of the church that stands with us and says, remember who God is and remember that we're here with you. I love someone that when things aren't great, they're still standing beside me. Do you have that person in your mind? That person who is a follower of Jesus that when everything else was crumbling around you, they were still there? That's what the body of Christ is supposed to look like. Change is hard. It's a challenge that we're all faced with. And as I've been reading this week, I've been thinking a lot about our church and this unique place that God has given us in this city. And yet at the same time, I've been thinking God's calling us into a season of change, and that's our next big challenge as a church. One day we'll take the next step. Annie and I will take a step of faith. You as a church will take a step of faith. And we have to say, how will we handle this obstacle? I think we handle it just like Nehemiah did. First thing, we have to remember the vision that God has for us. There are great churches in Chico. I love Christian people around our city. But you know what? God has given us a unique place. This is a place that fits who you are, who God's made you to be, and you have an opportunity to reach people that God has only used this church to reach. We have a fun, unique calling together. We have to remember that vision. Nehemiah knew his job was to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls so that worship could start at the temple. We have to remember, God's called us to be a unique group of people, to a community that needs to hear a message through the stories that we have. You have them. We need to pray a lot. We need to pray about the challenge. If we're not, then we're missing the opportunity to say, God, where are you in the midst of this? God, how do you help us through this? We need to be people who pray a lot. We need to keep in the battle. It's easy to stay comfortable by running away from challenges. It's easy. When things get hard, we run. We need to keep in the battle. There's no time for us to sit on the sideline and watch. We need to stay engaged. We need to have each other's back. There are going to be days that doubt creeps in. There's going to be days that obstacles seem overwhelming. And we need to come around each other and say, but we are the church. And we have each other's back. And we're with you. And we need to encourage each other with this truth. If God is for us, then who can be against us? If God is for us, who could be against us? In Joshua 1:9, this is a story that Nehemiah would have known, would have been passed down from generation to generation. Joshua takes command of the nation of Israel. There's this transition. And I bet the people of Israel are like, who in the world that ever could fill Moses' shoes? I think he wore size 13s. So who could do this? And God says, Joshua, you're it. And Joshua says, wait, what? How's this going to happen? And God says this. He says, this is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua grew Israel into what God promised it would be. Moses didn't. Moses wandered around. Didn't make it. Joshua got to lead them. Be strong and courageous, for I, the Lord, am with you. I don't care what you're facing this week. I don't care how big it seems. Your God is bigger. Your God is bigger than whatever challenge you face. I don't care how loud the voices of opposition are against the right things that you're trying to walk out in life. The voice you need to listen for is the one who says, you're my masterpiece. I died for you. I make the impossible possible. So here's how I want to end today. I want you to think about your life. Think about your story. And I want you to think about one of those moments that seemed utterly impossible. The obstacles were so big. The opposition was so strong that not only maybe your own mind said we can't, but everybody around you agreed. You can't. It's impossible. You'll never make it. I want you to think of that impossible moment, and then hopefully your story ends with God having made that possible. God having overcome what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Can you think of one of those moments where God took what the world thought was impossible and he said, I will make it possible because I am with you? If you can think of one of those moments, then the next time the obstacle comes, you remind the obstacle of what God has already brought you through. It's not just an obstacle, it's the impossible becoming possible. God is a miracle-writing author. And so many of you are his miracle, where he has brought impossible things and made them possible. Let's pray together.